Practices of faith, spirituality, and meditation have been embedded in human civilization since its beginning. The fact that they have endured over millennia would suggest that they benefit societies, families, and the individual. Otherwise, you'd assume they'd be forgotten, right? Many of us personally see the benefits to our lives, to our health, that our faith or spirituality brings. Within communities, stories are shared spanning generations of how faith, connection to something higher than ourselves, has enabled survival, triumph, and health. These kinds of stories abound. However, what hasn't been so abundant is the hard scientific data to support this. And this is where the work of Dr. Andrew Newberg and other researchers in his field comes in. Welcome to Vital Signs, where we look at how to get healthier from all angles, from the biochemical and nutritional to the things we do that nourish our minds and our souls. I'm Brendan Fallon. Dr. Newberg is a neuroscientist and pioneer in the study of religious and spiritual experiences from a neurological standpoint. How do faith, spirituality, meditation affect the brain? Dr. Newberg has some compelling answers to that.
If we're doing brain scans of somebody who has Alzheimer's disease, somebody who has depression, why can't we do a brain scan of somebody who is being spiritual or being religious? And that's really what kind of propelled us to begin to do brain imaging studies of these kinds of practices and these experiences that enabled us to push this entire field forward, a field that's sometimes referred to as neurotheology.
The results that are coming through, this is being used to propel this field of study of the benefits of spirituality and mindfulness and these kinds of practices.
Well, yes, I think basically what we're looking at is what is the mechanism of these practices. If you look at the research literature over the last 20 or 30 years, there's a lot of evidence to support the idea that practices like meditation and prayer can be beneficial for people in terms of helping them to reduce their stress, help them to cope with various issues and problems. There's even some evidence to suggest that being religious and spiritual can reduce your all-cause mortality, that you actually can live longer because you have some type of religious or spiritual beliefs. So the question is, if these are actual effects that seem to be occurring, how are they occurring? What's going on? What's going on in our brain? What's going on in our body? And being able to use these kinds of imaging techniques to be able to explore that, I think really is very important for us in terms of understanding kind of who we are as human beings, how we work as human beings, and how the religious and spiritual side of who many people are intersects with their biological side to kind of help them be the people that they want to be and try to help them stay as happy and healthy as they can going forward.
We'd love to hear about your own experiences of faith, spirituality, and mindfulness in the comments. Also, you can follow me at c.vitalsigns on Instagram and at Brendan Fallon on Twitter for notice of new videos. What would be a hallmark example of what's coming out from this research when you're doing these brain scans of people involved in spiritual or religious practices?
Well, I think one of the most important take-home messages is that there isn't just one part of our brain that turns on when somebody meditates or prays. There's not one part of our brains that's the spiritual part of our brain. It's many different parts of our brain that become activated in different kinds of patterns. And I think for anybody who has a spiritual practice, they'll understand that. I mean, there's various cognitive elements, emotional elements, experiential elements that are part of what it means to do a practice like prayer or meditation or to have a religious or spiritual feeling. And so we would expect all of these different parts of the brain to be affected by these practices. And so when we start to think about the actual health benefits of many of these practices, we can see that the practices themselves, for example, activate our frontal lobes, which are right behind our forehead, and that's involved in concentration and attention. It's also involved in helping to regulate our emotional responses. So perhaps by doing a practice like meditation, we will concentrate better and we will also regulate our stress and anxiety better. And that's exactly what we wind up seeing, not just in terms of what's going on in the brain, but what people are actually feeling clinically.
How does that manifest in these scans? What do you see specifically if someone's concentration is more focused at that time?
When somebody starts doing a meditation practice, we notice that the frontal part of the brain, right behind the forehead, it turns on, as we would say. It gets more blood flow, or it gets more metabolic activity, and that means it's working more. Now, interestingly, I mean, there's other parts of our brain that actually quiet down when we're doing a practice like meditation. So sometimes in some of the emotional centers of our brain, for example, a structure called the amygdala, which is very involved in our stress response, that can sometimes quiet down when we're doing a meditation practice where we're relaxing ourselves, where we're calming ourselves down. And one other area that I've been very interested in is an area called the parietal lobe. It's located in the back part of the brain. And this is an area of our brain that normally takes our sensory information and helps us to figure out kind of where we are in space and time. And so if this area starts to quiet down, then what we would expect to see is a person kind of losing their distinctive sense of self. They would feel a sense of connectedness, a sense of oneness. And this is something that's frequently described in these practices where people feel more connected with the universe, more connected with humanity, more connected with God, whatever the particular practice might lead to. And that's often been associated with these changes going on in the parietal lobe, along with the changes that are happening in the emotional and even the cognitive aspects of the brain.
So it's like a God phenomena happening in this particular region of the brain. I know that you mentioned before the amygdala. I know this is a part of the brain that features prominently with trauma, with post-traumatic stress disorder. So what are the implications for someone, of this research for someone who's suffering with trauma?
Well, exactly. I mean, when people have trauma, one of the main findings that we see is that when any hint of that traumatic event begins to arise in that person's experiences, whether they hear, a car backfire and they think when they were shot or something like that, your amygdala, which is one of the main areas in your brain that's involved in your fear response, that turns on. So in a brain scan, we see, a lot of blood flow or metabolism going on in that part of the brain. Now, when you do a practice like meditation or prayer, it can help to quiet or calm that part down. There's a balance between the limbic areas, which are emotional areas, and then our frontal lobes. And so that's why when you get very angry, you'll say things without thinking, as we often, because your frontal lobe shuts down, and so out come things that are just all based on emotions. On the other hand, when you have more control over your emotions, you can kind of think through, you can keep yourself calm, you can keep yourself, doing whatever it is that you need to do because your frontal lobes are regulating that better. And that's, I think, exactly what's happening with some of these practices like meditation and prayer that can help to kind of balance the brain better so that you don't have that extreme reaction. And even if it's a pretty bad trauma, people can sometimes find ways of working through that eventually.
I'm wondering if there's research where you've really looked more deeply into specifically the spiritual benefits and what's happening in the body to produce benefits with your research.
Well, we actually did one of the first longitudinal studies of people going through a very intensive spiritual retreat program. It was actually a retreat based on the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. So this was a Christian-based practice, and it was a kind of program where people went for about a week, and very intensive meditation, prayer, self-reflection. Most of it was done in silence. It was also included meeting with spiritual leaders and guides who could kind of help people through the process. And we scanned them before and we scanned them after. And one of the main scans that we did in this particular case wasn't looking at just the brain activity, as we were talking about a few moments ago, but this study was actually looking at different neurotransmitters in the brain, particularly the dopamine areas of the brain and the serotonin areas of the brain. And these are very important neurotransmitters when it comes to our mood, our emotions like depression. They're also very involved in responding to anxiety and stressors and so forth. And what we found was that when people, between the before and after of going through this retreat program, people had a significant change in their serotonin and dopamine areas of the brain. And the finding basically told us that their brain became more sensitive to the effects of dopamine and serotonin. And that to me is very important because both of them lead to more positive emotional responses. Dopamine is part of the reward system. So if your brain is now more sensitive to dopamine, that means you're probably going to feel better. And if you have a release of dopamine, you're going to feel happier. And that's going to ultimately have a very beneficial effect on your overall health and well-being. We also found that they were more sensitive to the effects of serotonin in much the same way that when people take an antidepressant medication, which is called an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Those are the medications like Prozac and Zoloft and so forth. So in many ways, you're kind of doing this naturally, that you basically kind of increase the serotonin, you increase your brain's sensitivity to the serotonin. And if that's what drugs are doing to help you be less depressed and less anxious, Well, here you found, a nice natural way of doing that.
Naturally.
Yeah, and to change your brain to do it that way. And this is a 1-week program, so you can imagine what would happen if you did it over many weeks, many months, many years. And that's also part of what studies have shown, that people who are long-term practitioners, long-term meditators, long-term prayers, they have fundamentally different brains than people who are non-meditators and non-prayers. And in many ways, the areas of the brain that are involved are the areas that we talked about, areas like the frontal lobe that help us to regulate our thoughts and our feelings. So if we can evoke these kinds of long-term changes by doing these practices, there's really a lot of interesting potential to see how these kinds of practices can be helpful for people.
Especially those who want to avoid the side effects of things like antidepressants. It's very, very hopeful indicator.
Exactly.
Yeah. I find it's really fascinating, like the example you just gave, and also my own experience with meditation. I noticed that if I haven't meditated for a while, but then I start, my skin changes, like my skin becomes healthier. And I wonder, what is this? Like what could possibly be happening that I'm just sitting there, basically? So what is happening? What is your understanding of what is actually happening to produce these effects?
Well, what's fascinating is that these practices, obviously they change the brain, but the brain is intimately connected to the body, so it regulates your body's reactions to life in general. One of the main ways it does that is through what's called the autonomic nervous system, and that it regulates our fight or flight response, which gets us sort of aroused and ready to fight back. That's what turns on when people have traumas. And also our quiescent system in our body that helps us to relax and to rejuvenate our energies and kind of help us to conserve our energy and feel good about things. And so meditation practices and prayer practices can help us to balance that more effectively. And the autonomic nervous system is connected to every part of our body, including our skin. It's involved in the amount of sweat that we have on our skin. The brain is also intimately connected with all of our hormone systems. So whether you're talking about the reproductive hormones, testosterone and estrogen, whether you're talking about stress hormones like cortisol, all of these are affected by these practices. And so when you do these practices, there are a whole variety of changes that you can ultimately see in the body that are in response to doing the practice. In fact, one other very important one, which we think is an important part of this whole process, is modifying the immune system and helping the immune system work more effectively. There were some studies done about 5 or 7 years ago that when people did a meditation practice and then they were given a vaccine like the flu vaccine, that the people who had meditated produced more antibodies to the flu vaccine.
Wow.
So, but it makes sense because when you are stressed, you produce cortisol, which suppresses your immune system. So if you meditate and you reduce your cortisol level, then your immune system can work more effectively.
Dr. Newberg, it's been fantastic to speak to you and to hear about these solid indicators that back up what mankind has known for millennia.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you.
How do faith, spirituality, meditation affect our health? Some compelling answers there from Dr. Andrew Newberg. Stay posted for my new interview with Dr. Daniel Monti, founding director of the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health, looking at an innovative approach to clearing unresolved stress. I'll leave the link to that video in this video's description once it's available. Lastly, you can follow me at c.vitalsigns on Instagram or at Brendan Fallon on Twitter to get notice of new videos. I'm Brendan Fallon, and this is Vital Signs.